Chapter 5. The Death Watch. The next few days passed much the same. The prince woke, was bound and gagged, tied to the horse, and forced to suffer in silence through a long day of riding. The only change was that he managed to devise a way to tilt his head at just the right angle so as to see out from under the hood. All that he ever saw, though, were rocks, trees, and other green things, with no end in sight. Try as he might to distinguish one mountain pass from another, he was unable to do so. How the exiles did he couldn't begin to understand, and he eventually gave up, head pounding and eyes throbbing due to the awkward angle. The exiles spoke rarely during the day, and never to the prince, except to give him directions. They would talk more openly at night around their campfire, if they made one, but unlike before, they spoke too softly for him to hear. Even Thomas, whose voice always gave the impression of a distant earthquake, kept his words sufficiently muted to prevent the prince from eavesdropping again. But they never ignored him completely, especially the girl, who always seemed to be watching. In fact, he realized that whenever he shifted, she shifted. Whenever he moved farther away from the fire, she moved closer, using the excuse of stirring the coals or adding another handful of bark and leaves, but always keeping an exact distance between them. "Where are you taking me?" he asked on the third night, breaking the silence during supper. The effect he had hoped for, that of a sudden and forceful interruption, was slightly ruined by the fact he was shivering from cold under his thin clothes and patchy blanket. The knowledge of their earlier conversation also still floated in the back of his mind, making him uneasy, and he felt suddenly uncomfortable when they looked directly at him. "Where do you think we're taking you?" the girl asked, her eyes gleaming in the firelight. The prince, certain she was mocking him, almost snapped back at her. But he cooled his temper when Thomas conspicuously set down his food, stretched his fingers, and rolled his shoulders. They had camped near a running stream that night, and the prince was cold enough without receiving another dunking in the name of good manners. "Never mind," he said, with as much dignity as he could muster, before focusing back on his dried meat and hard cheese. Thomas chuckled, a deep rolling rumble, and though the prince's cheeks burned, he stayed silent. This was the most significant interaction they had in those few days. The prince, who all his life had been inclined to introversion, had no complaints. The exile girl, whose name he was never able to catch no matter how hard he tried, was just as quiet, and it was usually Thomas who began any kind of conversation, often as not by commenting cheerfully on whatever seemed to be passing through his head. The girl would respond briefly. The prince, who was still gagged while traveling, would stay mute, and then they would all lapse back into silence. But on the seventh day of their journey, the prince's shoulders and chest began to prickle with an unnatural heat. Immediately he sat up straight in his saddle. Could it be? He shot a surreptitious glance at the two exiles from under his hood as best he could, and saw that they had noticed nothing. Both were out front of him, Thomas leading the way on his black charger, and the girl holding the reins of the pack horse the prince rode. He slouched back in the saddle, heart pounding, and tried to show no further signs of excitement. As the day progressed, the black markings on his shoulders and back continued to grow warmer as the Raven talisman sensed life, a fourth life, separate from him, Thomas, and the exile girl, coming closer and closer. There was someone behind them, farther back along the path the exiles were taking. The single point of light split into several, and he realized that it wasn't just one following them, it was many. Hope sprang into his heart again. A rescue party. It had to be. The bright points continued to gain on them. When they were only a mile away at most, the prince felt half of them separate from the others and move farther to the west and then pass beyond them, circling around to their front. He and the exiles were moving through the middle of a wide ravine with high, rocky slopes on either side. Tall trees that provided perfect cover for an ambush topped the slopes, and stunted trees grew along the path as well, forcing the exiles to weave back and forth. The horses' hooves made barely any sound as they walked. The ground was soft dirt covered by a thin layer of fallen leaves that were as skinny and sharp as needles. The day was cloudy, the sun hidden, and everything had an iron-gray cast to it that seemed to flatten and wash away the color of the world. "This is it," he thought. "They've come to bring me back." He tilted his head under the hood, and his eyes locked onto the girl walking in front of him, calm and unbothered. Beyond her was Thomas, just visible in the gloom, scouting slowly ahead on his enormous stallion, but not far enough to see the group closing in around them. The prince allowed himself a small smile. He reached out with his mind and felt again the points of light and heat, the sparks of men's lives, moving slowly with them toward the end of the ravine, which led out into a wide, funnel-shaped valley. And then something strange filtered through the talisman. He frowned in concentration, but he couldn't manage to grab onto the feeling. Something whined and shivered in his mind's eye, and then slipped away. The lights began to flicker and bounce oddly. First they were on his right side, then they were on his left. Then gone, then up ahead, then above him, which made no sense. He focused harder and, despite the cold, felt a bead of sweat run from his temple, trace the line of his jaw, and fall onto his shirt. Finally, he located the source of the nebulous something, and realized the strange feeling was coming from 2 points of light that felt different from the others. They felt wrong. They weren't bright enough somehow. In fact, it was as if they were only half there. Why is that familiar? He'd sensed it somewhere before, but where? His head suddenly throbbed and an image of the fortress came to mind. But no one in the fortress felt like that. The children would stand out even more strongly, like beacons, and guardians would too to a lesser extent. No, what he would expect from them was directly at odds with this strange sense of hollowness, as if the lights had been shrouded in the cloaking mask of night. A sharp whistling filled the air from all directions, and immediately both exiles converged on the prince. His horse panicked and he fell off, once more sliding down the side of the beast. As he fell, his hood was yanked away from his face by 2 somethings he couldn't see. He cried out through the gag, his stomach lurching as he swung off the side of the horse. Tomas grabbed him and with 2 quick flashes of a dagger cut the ropes holding him in place. The prince dropped free and fell to the ground in a heap as Tomas whirled away on his black stallion. More dark streaks shot through the air. 2 of them struck the prince's horse, and it shrieked in pain and surprise, the sound deafeningly loud. "They're on both sides," the girl yelled. Another dark, blurred shape streaked past the prince's face, stinging the bridge of his nose, and he recoiled in shock. He crab-walked backwards as quickly as he could up the side of the small valley and ducked behind a large bush between 2 trees. His hand landed on one of the black streaks and he picked it up. It was a small arrow, both head and shaft painted black, with black raven's feathers for fletching. His mind flashed back to the blackened dart the exile girl had pulled from his neck, with its hollow points. He made the connection and felt again the 2 wavering, less-than-human points of light, just before they dimmed even further and then faded completely from his mind. "Death Watchman," he gasped. It wasn't a rescue party. It was an assassination. His daze was interrupted when a man dressed all in black with a drawn short sword burst into view from the foliage on the side of the ravine. The prince stood and motioned for the man to halt, pulling himself up to his full height and assuming an imperious stance. "Stop," he commanded. The man ignored him and slashed at his head. "I am the Prince of Ravens. I order you to stop." The man swung again, just missing the prince's outstretched hand. The prince, out of pure alarm, sidestepped, and the man's own weight sent him sprawling through the bushes beyond. There was the sound of him hitting something, the crack of a branch breaking, and then a fading shriek. In alarm, the prince plunged through the bushes after the man, and immediately pulled up short, only just managing to stop himself before he fell head first into a hidden chasm, an ugly 5-foot-wide gap of black emptiness where the ground and the side of the valley ravine should have met. More arrows shot past his head, striking the ravine wall. He quickly ducked and moved back toward the valley floor, diving behind a tree just as a black metal arrowhead hissed through where he had been not a second before. The sound of steel on steel came from in front of him. He rounded the tree to see the giant engaged with a group of men in black farther down the funnel-shaped valley, using the limited space to force his attackers to engage him 2 by 2. No doubt the high ravine walls amplified the sound of their weapons, but the battle still looked extremely fearsome to the prince's eyes. Tomas's cloak had been thrown back and the shirt underneath had been ripped and torn by arrows. Through the tears the prince could see strange glints and flashes of silver, and with a start of surprise he realized that the giant had been wearing a concealed layer of armor beneath his clothing all this time. A large, hastily donned half-helm encompassed his head, protecting the sides and back of his neck as well as the top of his head from the arrows that were still raining down. But the arrows were thinning. The exile girl had scaled the stone walls. How, the prince couldn't understand, and was dealing swift and silent death to the archers with her 2 wickedly curved daggers. Her forest-colored clothing blended perfectly with the shadows of the trees, and her long black hair flowed behind her, drinking in the light, wrapping her in a shifting patch of darkness. Aside from brief glimpses, he was only able to track her movement by the shocked cries of the men she came upon, like a vengeful spirit. But these were all ordinary men, highly trained but ordinary just the same. Where were the 2 Death Watchmen, the true Death Watchmen? Before he could search the surrounding area, the bushes rustled on his right, and another man burst from concealment. With a short thrust of a black steel blade, the man attacked the prince, almost eviscerating him on the spot. But instinct and training took over, and instead of retreating, the prince stepped smartly inside the range of the sword, rendering the blow useless. He grabbed the man's arm and delivered a lightning-fast flurry of blows to the soldier's elbow, shoulder, and knee. There was a series of cracks, and the man let out a gasp of surprise. He tried to swing his sword again, but his arm didn't work properly anymore. The prince redirected the poorly executed swipe, struck the man's wrist with stiff fingers, and dropped to one knee to catch the sword as it fell from the useless hand. The prince looked up and saw the man gazing down at him in panic. With only a second's hesitation, he swung the blade upward and ended the man's life. The prince felt that life add onto his own. The talisman etched into his chest and shoulders was named for the raven because it feasted on death, and when the prince killed, it fed off the soul of the slain man or woman, augmenting the prince's life with theirs. His physical strength, his senses, his speed, all were doubled. But, equally doubled, was his sense of pain, his anger, his hate, and all the most powerful emotions and urges of the man he'd killed. In effect, he became two people in one body. But worst, always worst of all, were the memories. The details of the soldier's life coursed through his mind as the sensations of a lifetime dug into his skin, both with enough force to almost send him reeling into madness. Images of a family flashed across his eyes, and a wife whom he loved very dearly. His dedication to the Empress had led him to volunteer for a mission with the Death Watch. He would be returning to her soon, and with payment from this job they would buy the house on... The sound of footsteps on hard rock, amplified now in the prince's ears, penetrated his split mind, and with a huge force of will he reasserted his true identity and blocked out the memories. His eyes opened, catching details too small for normal eyes to see, and he saw 4 men rushing toward him. With burgeoned strength pounding through his limbs, the prince raised the dead man's sword and stepped into the middle of the onrushing group. He was a whirlwind of steel. In a matter of moments, the 4 men lay bleeding on the ground, alive but quite unable to fight. The prince stood there for a moment, breathing heavily, and tried to control his racing heart and the bloodlust that came from the dead soldier's instincts. He looked up to see Thomas and the Exile girl, who had now descended to fight beside the giant, under attack from both sides. He moved toward them. A sound in the bushes to his right, so quiet he would have missed it but for his enhanced hearing. He whipped around to see a skeletal form dressed in black armor, bearing cruel, twisted spikes at the shoulders, elbows, and knees, slink from concealment. It wore no helm, and the prince looked into empty eye sockets, from the depths of which glowed not eyes but sickly green lights. A bare semblance of skin was stretched across the skull, showing the half-life nature of the creature. It opened its mouth in a smile, showing its withered tongue and gumless teeth. Shivers chased themselves down the prince's back as he looked into the face of a nightmare. "My prince," the Death Watchman rasped. It drew a black onyx sword from a sheath at its hip, a sword that drank in the light around it like a thirsty demon, leaving it cloaked in an ever-shifting halo of shadows. "You've been missed," it said, and lunged. The prince dodged back a step, avoiding the sword. The watchman lunged again with inhuman strength and speed, the onyx blade whistling and hissing through the air like a thing alive and thirsty for blood. "Stop," he cried. "I command you to stop." "I don't take your commands anymore," the skeletal mouth sneered at him. It let out a maniacal cackle that reverberated off the walls of the ravine. The prince felt a chill that had nothing to do with the fearful nature of the creature before him. Death Watchmen traded their souls to the clockwork Visigony for immortality, but in return they were sworn to obey the commands of the Empress and the children, even if it meant surrendering the last bare shred of life that kept them anchored to the world. A watchman couldn't deny the command of one of the children. It was impossible. "You lie!" he screamed in its face. "I am one of the children!" The Death Watchman laughed again with terrifying glee and swung its black sword. The prince retreated quickly, his enhanced strength and speed allowing him to fend off the attacks, for now. But the Death Watchman worked in pairs, and if the second one came on him while he was fighting the first, he was doomed. He tried to reach out through his talisman in order to locate the second watchman, but the black onyx sword of the first flashed toward his throat and broke his concentration. A length of curved steel shot past him, barely inches from his head, and buried itself in the watchman's left eye socket, eliciting a shocked scream of anger. There was a sizzling sound, and he watched, amazed, as a dagger burned the skin of the watchman's face. But, undaunted, the watchman continued forward, raised its sword high overhead, and brought it down on the prince's blade, shattering it. Throwing away the broken blade, the prince dove to the side, just in time to see Thomas and the Exile girl hurtle past him. The Death Watchman snarled as it pulled the Exile girl's dagger from its eye, even as the blade made the flesh on its hand sizzle and smoke. The Exiles attacked, engaging it in a flurry of blows. The prince reached back through the talisman, searching for the second watchman. He turned around in a quick circle, searching for the sickly, half-dead glow, but it was nowhere to be found. That's impossible. I just felt it a moment ago. Where did it go? He strained his mind and his eyes, concentrating harder, searching for that tiny, wavering point of light. But just as he felt he was about to reach it, the first watchman broke free and ran straight for him. Again reacting on instinct, he stepped forward inside the range of the blow intended to cleave him in two and returned the attack, kicking out a foot to swipe its legs from under it. But the watchman moved aside with the speed of a striking snake and brought its onyx blade around in a chopping motion intended to behead him. The Exile girl was there waiting, and she dug her second dagger into the base of the thing's neck, sending the blow awry. The prince noted mentally that she was well informed. The only way to kill a watchman was to sever the brain from the body. But her dagger missed the creature's spine, and the watchman threw her off and turned once more to the prince. It feinted to the left, to the right, and then out of nowhere a heavily booted foot appeared and smashed into the prince's chest, knocking him on his back and forcing the breath from his lungs. He rolled to the side as his vision narrowed. Stars winked in front of his eyes and his body cried out for air. The watchman's blade snaked out once more, and with a hair-raising screech dug into the rock not an inch from the prince's head. The skeletal face of the monster split into a smile of ghastly glee as it raised its sword once more. The prince had nowhere to run. A flash of silver and blue steel. The Death Watchman's expression turned to confusion as its sword dropped from its hands, and then it crumpled slowly to the ground, where its head rolled loose from its body. A bare second later, both head and body began to decompose, generating a horrific stench. Tomas sheathed his sword and slung it onto his back. He reached out a huge hand and pulled the prince to his feet. The prince clutched at a rock outcropping on the side of the ravine, still trying to pull air into his lungs. "That was close," the girl said. She had retrieved her daggers and stood surveying the scene around them. Suddenly she tensed. "Tomas, I only count 22. One's missing." As if on cue, a man dressed in black burst from concealment and raced off. Tomas shot one glance at the girl, who nodded quickly, and he took off after the man. "Well, looks like that's it." The prince shook his head desperately, trying with all his might to force breath back into his lungs. Little black dots were floating across his vision, but he managed to stay standing. Frantically, his eyes darted over the girl's shoulders. He searched the forest, trying to see through the shadows cast by the trees, turning left, right, even looking behind him. "Did they hit you on the head?" she asked, obviously questioning his sanity. "We got all of them. You can calm down now." "No," he gasped, unable to say more, his lungs still trying desperately to take in air. Spots of light danced before his eyes, but he blinked them away and tried to breathe deeply. He only succeeded in inducing a huge coughing fit, his lungs burning as if he had pulled in a breath of fire instead of air. Desperately, he started trying to mime the message, flailing his arms about. "You're fine now, Your Majesty," she said, misinterpreting the message as anger. "Not that I expected thanks." He took one last deep pull of air and finally, blessedly, his lungs expanded. "Two," he croaked. "Always two." A soft twang followed by a whistling sound reached his ears, and he dropped to the ground without hesitation. There was a cry, and he looked up to see the arrow had flown past him and impaled the girl on the shoulder. Before he could react, the sound of running feet came from behind him, and he turned to see another Death Watchman, this one much bigger, and wielding an enormous black war axe. "Shadows and light," he cursed with the little air he'd managed to take in. It was all he could do to dive out of the way of an overhand strike that would have cleaved him clean in two as the huge creature bull-rushed him. He rose to his feet and backed away quickly, but the Death Watchman followed him without missing a beat. Whoever it had been in life had been an enormous hulk of a man, nearly as large as Tomas, and the prince was struck with sudden fear at the thought that this might have been a guardian. The watchman swung into a series of moves that the prince recognized as the opening of the gun-axe form, and his fears were confirmed. Frantically, he looked around himself. A weapon. He needed a weapon. Anything to defend himself, even one of the girl's daggers. There! It was a short sword, clutched in the lifeless hands of one of the human watchmen, and with lightning speed he grabbed it and fell into the second Zabodi sword form, deflecting the watchman's swing and retreating quickly. He tried an overhand strike, but it was easily deflected as the watchman twirled his axe in a move called spinning the silk. Despite the strength and speed he'd gained from the dead soldier, the prince was forced back again by the creature. and he began to accumulate a series of burning wounds from the watchman's enormous weapon. His shoulder stung and ached where a cut had sliced deep into the muscle, and blood flowed freely from his side where the axe had scraped across his ribs. At the last second, the prince ducked a blow that should have taken his head off, but which instead buried the watchman's axe in a strange, gnarled tree growing on the side of the ravine. The prince seized his chance and attacked, striking out with a quick thrust to the watchman's arm, hoping to incapacitate it. The watchman responded so quickly that the prince didn't even know what had happened until he was flying through the air. He landed nearly 20 feet away, dazed at the foot of a pile of rocks. He tried to come to his feet, looking around desperately for his sword, but he fell back as his head throbbed sickeningly and his legs gave out beneath him. He looked around, hoping desperately that the girl was nearby and that she might intervene, but she had disappeared. She had cut her losses and abandoned him. The watchman ripped its axe from the tree, pulling with it a chunk of wood so large that the tree leaned drunkenly to the side, and then in slow motion teetered and crashed to the ground. The prince tried again to stand, but this time his leg crumpled beneath him, and he let out a cry of pain. He frantically tried again, but his ankle shook so violently that even with his added strength it wouldn't let him rise. And then the watchman was there, standing over him. He looked up into the enormous skeletal mask, skin stretched too tightly across a once human face, glowing green eyes staring from the pitted eye sockets and boring a hole into him with their insistent fiery gaze. "The Prince of Ravens," it said in a voice like the crypt. Its vocal cords had long since dried out, and it was in a rasping whisper that it spoke. It stood towering over him, the axe clutched tightly in its right hand, savoring the moment and the prince's helplessness. The prince tried to rise once more, but in vain. He began to pull himself up the pile of rocks, dragging his useless foot behind him, but the watchman reached out, grabbed him, and hoisted him into the air, turning him so that they were face to face. "I will be greatly rewarded for bringing the Empress back your head. She is so concerned for your safety." The prince's mouth went dry. He tried to speak but could think of nothing to say. It was all impossible. "Or perhaps another part of your body." The watchman smiled, its rotted lips pulling back to expose dry, gumless teeth held together by sorcery alone. It swished the great axe through the air, razor-sharp black blade catching and refracting the sickly, burning light of the creature's eyes in twisting patterns. "My orders were admittedly unspecific." The prince finally found his voice. "Who gave you the orders?" he croaked. "Which of the children?" The watchman gave a bone-chilling laugh that rasped and coughed. "I don't have to answer any of your questions anymore." The prince, with a force of will that he never would have thought he possessed, thrust his face forward and let his voice roll out in a crack of sound. "Tell me!" he roared. The watchman stumbled and dropped the prince, who landed painfully on his back, still staring into the fiery green eyes. The hand holding the axe faltered as if it were suddenly unsure of itself. The prince fought for control of the creature, trying to force his will on the watchman. How did Ricard do this so easily? Sweat broke from his forehead. The watchman shook its head and the moment passed. A thought seemed to occur to it. "Do you not know?" The prince remained silent. The watchman laughed and eyed him like a dog that had cornered a rat. "My orders come from your mother, little prince." Fire shot through the prince's body to the tips of his fingers and toes. He felt lightheaded. "Don't lie to me," he snarled. "Don't lie to me." The green, demonic eyes flamed brighter, and the creature cackled, a sound like 1,000 nails scraped across stone. The onyx axe swept upward in an arc, and then plunged toward the prince's chest. The prince lay in shock, unable to defend himself, even if he'd had the strength to do so. An enormous swath of rippling steel interposed itself between the prince and the axe. The gleeful triumph on the Death Watchman's skeletal face became a mask of fury. It leapt back with a snarl that cut off abruptly as anger turned to shocked disbelief. "You!" Thomas stepped into the prince's view. He held his huge greatsword loosely in his right hand as if it weighed nothing. His clothing was ripped, but his armor and his helm gleamed even in the grey light of the cloudy day. The prince looked up into the face of the watchman through a red haze that had settled over his vision. Vaguely, he registered that the watchman was afraid. If he hadn't known better, he would have said it was terrified. What scares one of the watchmen? "You're dead!" it screamed, the ghoulish voice twisting the words into a scream of such ripping, throat-tearing fury that no living thing could have uttered it. "No, Zarath," the giant said. "Not yet." Tomaz flowed forward, steel blade flashing as it hit pockets of sunlight streaming through the clouds above. As big as the Death Watchman was, Tomaz was bigger. He seemed to be everywhere at once, in front, behind, to either side. Scratches began to appear in the Watchman's black armor, as the huge steel blade came closer and closer to sinking into the corrupted flesh. Rips and tears formed in the creature's black clothing, and streaming rivulets of yellow-green ichor began to flow from where the steel blade cut and slashed. The axe seemed a child's toy next to the great sword that whistled through the air with supernatural speed. With a final overhand strike, the sword cut the haft of the axe cleanly in two, leaving the Watchman with the axe head in one hand and a long piece of useless black wood in the other. The Watchman turned to run, fear, rage, and inhuman strength driving it, too quickly for Tomaz to follow. It reached the tree line and threw one last look over its shoulder, its face a mask of rage. A slim form stepped from the shadows of the closest tree, and with a flash of steel, a dagger was driven into the chink in the Watchman's armor underneath the left shoulder. The dagger, long as it was, pierced the thing's heart, freezing it in place. Another dagger flashed, digging into the back of its neck, severing the spine, and killing it instantly. The Watchman dropped like a marionette with its strings cut, and the prince felt the small, wavering drop of its life disappear. Black axe, an empty case of armor, and a horrid stench. The girl stepped into the clearing, eyes scanning all around. "You were telling the truth," the prince said blankly. "They were trying to kill me." He felt numb and empty. He should feel something, shouldn't he? Out of the corner of his eye, he saw the two exiles exchange a glance. After a moment of tension, the girl knelt and wiped her dagger on a piece of dead soldier's clothing. "Come on," she said, the barest hint of softness creeping into her voice. She roughly cleared her throat. "They won't be alone. We need to get through the mountains and disappear. See what we can find out about how many people are hunting you. The Death Watch is bound to have left word of its location, and there are always patrols in this area, 2, sometimes 3, roaming around looking for bandits. We should go." She trailed off, and pink spots bloomed on her cheeks. "Come on, Princeling," she commanded with the customary steel in her voice, moving off toward the deeper cover of the trees farther down the ravine. Like an automaton, the prince rose and walked in her direction. The girl addressed herself to Tomaz over his shoulder. "Do you want to do a quick scouting run? We want to know if we're in the clear or not. We might not survive another ambush like this one." "Wait," the prince said. "There are no more living nearby, only us." A brief silence followed his statement. "What does that mean?" the girl asked, her eyes narrowing dangerously. "I'm the Prince of Ravens," he responded numbly, voice still monotone and lifeless. "I can sense life. There are no more living in this forest aside from the 3 of us. Not for at least a mile in any direction." The girl's face turned from one of steely calm to one of red-hot rage, and the prince registered that this was cause for alarm. But he couldn't seem to muster up the energy to do anything about it. Tomaz laid a hand on the prince's shoulder and turned him around. "What are you saying?" he rumbled quietly. Before the prince could respond, the girl spoke. "You knew they were here." It was a simple statement, but it caught the prince's attention. His hearing, still enhanced from the soldier's death, caught the whisk of metal being drawn from a sheath, and he turned back just in time to see the girl launch herself across the clearing, daggers in hand. With a roar of alarm, Tomaz interposed himself between the 2 of them, and just in time. The girl pulled up short, held back by the man's outstretched and warding hands. "You were going to let them kill us. You were going to offer us up to save your own hide," she snarled at the prince, shouting past Tomaz. "I thought they were here to rescue me," he shouted back at her, shocked at the state she was in. "No one is going to rescue you," she screamed. She turned back to the clearing and gestured in a wide circle, taking in the bodies of the men lying dead on the ground. "They were hunting you, O great Prince of Ravens. I don't know where they got their orders, but do you really think that once it's clear they're dead, there won't be more? You were kidnapped in the capital city of the Empire, right under the Empress's nose. You survived, barely clinging to life long enough for Tomaz, an exile, which I know must gall you to no end, to save your worthless life. Now, Death Watchmen appear in the middle of the Elmist Mountains to finish the job and kill you, and you're still clinging to the hope that someone is going to come save you? Wake up, Princeling!" She spun on her heel and made her way into the trees in the direction of where they had first been ambushed. The prince stood staring at her, mouth open, as Tomas slowly lowered his hands and walked over to him. The big man grabbed him by the arm and pulled the soldier's notched sword out of his grip. "Come," he rumbled, helping the prince, limping on his bad ankle, in the direction the girl had gone. When they reached the end of the ravine, they saw that the girl had already repacked their bags and was tending to the horse that had been hit by the watchman's arrows. She had removed the arrows and staunched the bleeding with strips of cloth from the same blanket that had provided the material for the prince's restraints and gag. As they came closer, they saw her reach up her sleeve and bring out a rudimentary set of needle and thread, and after the wounds had been stitched and covered with bandages, the horse seemed, if not fine, at least ready to ride again. "You do him," she told Tomas, jerking her head at the prince. Her jaw was clenched, and it seemed to be taking all the willpower she had not to turn and launch herself at him again. "You don't want me around him right now." Tomas made no comment. He simply nodded and pulled his own needle and thread from the pouch at his waist, and, after removing the prince's shirt, began to stitch him up. The needle hurt, but the prince was still in a state of shock and could barely form coherent words, much less protest to the giant's ministrations. Once Tomas had finished, he pulled a few of the strips left from the torn blanket and attached them to 2 long, straight pieces of wood, which held the prince's ankle straight. Then, without any more exchange of words, the big man threw him another spare shirt, fashioned new bonds for his wrists, and tied him to the pack horse once more. The girl grabbed the reins, viciously threw the cloak and hood over him, and then the 3 of them were off once more, almost as if nothing had happened. As if they hadn't been ambushed. As if one of the Death Watchmen hadn't just tried to kill the prince in his mother's name. It occurred to him then that maybe the girl was right. No, there had to be another reason. It had to all be a misunderstanding. It was impossible that... But it wasn't. Here was the hard proof. Not only had he been kidnapped from the fortress itself, but the Death Watchman had told him its orders had come from the Empress. Mother. No, it wasn't possible. He shook his head to clear the treasonous thoughts. It had to be one of the children. It had to be. But if it was one of his siblings, how had they corrupted the Watchmen? The ordinary soldiers could be bought or bribed, but the actual Watchmen, the Death Watch constructs that formed the center of the group, they cared nothing for money or material gain. This thought led him back to the ordinary man he had killed, and the memories of that man's life came back to him, jumbled and confused and already fading as time passed. Desperate, he did something he had only done a handful of times before. He dredged up the other man's memories from the back of his mind, where he had forced them, and began to go through them, one by one, looking for anything useful. The process was painful. Not physically so, but mentally, and the prince tried to make it go as quickly as possible. Memories of a wife flashed through him, and a sudden fount of love sprang up and began to flow in his heart. Yes, his wife, Maya. Memories of making love to her, of their young children and his pride that his son was growing tall and strong. He had to get back to her. She would be waiting for him to return, and— "No," the prince said harshly, reasserting control over his mind. He wasn't this man. He was the Prince of Ravens, even if he had no name. Even though Mother had stripped him of it, even though he was being hunted, he was still a prince. He had to be, or else, what was he? Sweat had begun to bead on his forehead with the force of his concentration, and the hood was now uncomfortably stifling, but he couldn't stop. He needed answers. So he waded once more into the mire of memories. Another few minutes, he found what he was looking for. The memory of when the man had received the order to move out from the fortress. The orders had come from the true Death Watchmen. The 2 skeletal creatures had called together a cell of the lesser foot soldiers, and they had set out the next day. There was no memory of a conspiracy, no memory of anything but the man's fear at meeting the 2 creatures, and of their briefing that they were to hunt down and assassinate a dangerous traitor to the Empress. Angry and exhausted, the prince shoved the memories away, and as he did, he felt them fade completely from his mind, along with the rest of the soldier's strength. His vision returned to normal, as did his hearing and other senses, and his emotions were once again his own, calm and under his control. So it was the Death Watchmen themselves who'd received the orders. That meant one of 2 things. Either they had received their orders from the Empress through her hand, or one of his siblings had managed to corrupt them. If the former, the girl was right and he truly was a marked man. If the latter... The magnitude of the task amazed him. He didn't even know where one would begin to attempt to corrupt a watchman. But then again, his siblings had been alive much longer than he. and until he received his inheritance, as was custom, he was only privy to certain information. Ricard alone had been born over half a millennium ago. It was quite possible that he and the others had access to knowledge far beyond what the prince had. But even if that was possible, would any of his siblings truly move so openly against him? Princes of the realm had conflicting spheres of power in the land of Lucia. The borders of each of the realms that made up the empire were not defined, and they were specifically kept that way by the Empress in order to sow discord among the children. Perhaps one of his siblings had found a loophole in the conditioning of the Death Watchman and exploited it, keeping the information from his siblings in an effort to gain power. But it all came back to the single most important question: who would risk such a move? It was dangerous in the extreme for the children to act openly against each other. The prince hadn't been alive long enough to act against or be acted against by one of the others, but he knew the histories. Not 50 years ago, Ricard, Prince of Lions, had moved openly against the third eldest child, Daisuna, Prince of Wolves. The Empress herself had seen to Ricard's punishment, and it was rumored that she had spared him not at all because he was her first son and commander of the imperial armies. The punishment, of which the Prince of Ravens had only heard rumors, and vague ones at that, had been enough to discourage more acts of violence between the children for 50 years. It was also rumored that the Empress was angrier that Ricard had failed and been found out than that he had committed the act in the first place. And besides, to Ricard, 50 years must seem no more than a brief span of time. To Joffred, the second eldest at 4.5 centuries, who spent all of his time in the mountain castle of Erie, poring over the deepest histories and prophecies of Lucia as was his duty, 50 years would be nothing, and the prince's own 17 years no more than a blink. The inheritance. I was summoned to receive mine on the day I was taken. It was well known that the Empress, ever suspicious and calculating, tested the loyalty of her subjects. In fact, the testing was often more intense the more important a person's task was to be. The thought being that if the subjects survived, it would prove and ensure their loyalty, binding them closer to the Diamond Throne. When Samantha had delivered his summons, his first thought had been that he was to receive his inheritance. All the signs had pointed to it. Could it be that his mother had engineered this after all? Excitement thrilled through him as the pieces began to form a larger picture. Could this all be a test? A move to discern the prince's trustworthiness as a child of the Empress? Perhaps the Death Watchman had been sent by his mother, or even one of his siblings on her orders, to be certain that he was ready. Energy surged in him. Of course. This was the answer it had to be. He was being tested, and if he was intelligent enough to escape and return to Lucien to face his mother, she would then give him his inheritance to the final city and his mandate to sweep the exiled from the empire. But was he ready? He had assumed his inheritance would come years later, that at most he was going to be told to prepare himself. Could it all be happening this quickly? He shook his head, dispelling the doubts in the blazing light of the revelation that his mother had not abandoned him. If the Empress thought him ready, then he was ready. She was all-knowing. But then, what was to be his next move? He needed information, that much was certain, and he needed the 2 exiles to drop their guards so that he could escape. But he didn't even know where they were or where they were headed. Wait. Another thrill shot through him. He did know where they were. The girl had told him, had let it slip while she was berating him. Appear in the middle of the Elmist Mountains. The Elmist Mountains were a far distance south of Lucien, separating Tyne and Lerne from one another to the east and west, and they terminated in the south just north of the city of Bainlin. Tyne was the seat of his brother Ricard, and the prince knew immediately that that wasn't where the exiles were headed, for the citizens who lived there, persuaded by the lion talisman, were fanatically loyal to Ricard, and such a place would be suicide for the exiles. Lerne, the seat of Samantha, was equally treacherous, as was the home province of the Seekers, who were just as dangerous in their own way as the Death Watchmen, if not more so. No, they would be heading directly south, to Bainlin. That was the answer. That was where they were headed, and that was where he would make his escape. The city was large but not modern enough to be the seat of any of the children, and in fact one of the cities that fell in the strange no-man's land between realms of the Empire, with multiple children often laying claim to it. It had long been suspected that the exiled used hidden way stations there to spy on the movement of troops in the Empire, and that meant that there was bound to be a seeker there too, to spy upon the spies. The Seekers of Light were feared by everyone in the Empire, commons and high alike. Even the Most High were known to speak softly and carefully when in the presence of the elusive eyes and ears of the Empress. But the Seekers were sworn to the children, just as they were sworn to the Empress, and so he had nothing to fear from them. If he could slip away from the exiles and the press of such a large city, perhaps even just on the outskirts, chances were that he would be able to make his way to the Seeker, and once there he'd be safe from the exiles and able to make his way back to Lucien. The prince peered out from under his hood at the backs of the exiles and felt a strange pang deep in his chest. They had saved his life, even if it had been for their own gain. It didn't change anything, not really, but the girl could have run, and instead she'd brought back the giant in order to face the final Death Watchman, to save the prince at great personal risk. But they were exiles, and a single virtuous act did not cancel out a lifetime of wrongdoing, of that he was certain. However, he realized that he couldn't turn them in. He owed them a debt now, one he had to repay. In fact, he owed the giant 2 debts, if he truly had nursed the prince back to health after he'd been left for dead. I'll leave them in the mountains outside of Bainland, he decided. If the maps of Lucia he'd seen in the fortress libraries were accurate, the city was nestled at the southern foot of the mountain range. He'd leave them there and make his own way into the city. He'd craft some story for the Seeker, how he had slipped away from them days earlier and had no knowledge of where they'd gone. It was the best he could do to repay them. Their exiled kindred. They should be happy and willing to do that much. But still his conscience panged him, something that he tried to smother as a sign of weakness. But nothing he told himself stamped it out completely, and as the day wore on, he became once more lost in the mire of his thoughts.